So here's a little thing that I don't really talk about a lot. I speak a lot about radicalization, but it's very rare that I speak about why I'm interested in it and why I feel like I have an insider's view of radicalization. The fact is that even though today I am known mostly as a human rights activist and a liberty activist, and I call myself an Islamic libertarian, at some point, let's say around, I would say the high time would be around 2006 or 2005, I was myself radicalized. At some point of time, I actually believed in Salafi jihadism. I pored over Salafi jihadist material, I read all of their literature, and I was convinced of their worldview. When it comes to leaving an ideology, people ask me how does it really happen when you leave an ideology, and I keep telling them that you change little by little by little by little until one day you look at yourself and you're like, I don't believe in that anymore. But there was a watershed moment, and the watershed moment happened, I remember it very clearly because I remember it down to the date. It was March 15th, 2011, when I felt an immense sense of regret, an immense sense of not just regret, I would also say guilt for ever having held those beliefs. And I remember crying in my room. I was back then I was still in the United Arab Emirates, crying over the fact that I allowed this con to be pulled over my eyes for so long. And this is why I feel I have an insider's view of radicalization, of the process of getting radicalized, the process of getting de-radicalized, and also of the ideology behind radicalization. And I have been studying this very intently for 6 years now. So this is the kind of perspective that I bring to the table. A little bit about that moment, that cathartic moment of de-radicalization. So I would say over the 1990s, maybe up to the mid-2000s, there was a brand of Islamist populism that was, in certain Arab countries, was actually state-sponsored. Today we hear about what's something that's called the Sahwa movement in Saudi Arabia. So this was the movement that was at its height at the time when I was growing up. And it kind of hit its peak around 2001 with the 9/11 attacks. We're going to speak later in the presentation, about the populist grand narrative and how different populist narratives look alike, whether it's Islamist or white supremacism, etc. But I really only saw it. So it was, I would call it the jihad myth. Or even, I mean, let's call it actually, let's reverse it and let's call it the Crusader myth. The Crusader myth is that Muslims are under attack by a uniform external enemy who is allying with local traitors to take away the let me say the agency of native Muslims. This was the narrative that was hammered on and on and on in very emotional lectures. Sometimes it's not even the I would say it's not even the narrative itself, but rather it's the worldview around which the narrative is, about which the narrative is formed, that's drilled into you more and more and more as you're growing up. Perhaps the one thing that makes it stick is when real life events correspond to it. You see, if ideology always exists, you're never going to actually get rid of all the books. Ideology is always going to be in books, right? What makes it jump from books to a lived reality, what makes it jump from books to something that people actually believe and act on is the lived reality. Does your reality correspond to that? And I guess we're going to speak a little bit more about that in a bit. But what I only noticed the myth or the con that was pulled on my eyes when I saw it being pulled in reverse. when I saw the jihad myth being perpetrated or being proposed to people in the West. It was the fact that it was basically the idea that Muslims are waging a holy war. All Muslims are part of that conspiracy, and they want to basically take away the agency and basically invade and take over the West. This is, of course, ISIS's ideology. But it's a complete lie to say that every Muslim believes this or every Muslim is part of the grand conspiracy. And it's only when I saw this that I actually started realizing that radicalization has several paths, it has several ideologies, it has several narratives, but in the end it looks the same. The steps are the same. So eventually what I came to do is actually put those, I think I'll have to get rid of. So what I did is actually bring those points together in a 7-step roadmap that I call the radicalization roadmap. And I actually, when I was forming this, I was thinking about my own radicalization. I was thinking about the radicalization narratives and ideologies that I'm aware of. But I was also thinking a lot about different radicalization narratives that maybe I'm not 100%, I'm not exactly familiar with, not from the inside, but I can see them, being proposed. And this is the roadmap. It's a 7-step process, which I'm using right now as a model to explain radicalization and also de-radicalization. So it starts with otherization. Otherization is the idea that we are separate. We're different. Otherization on its own is benign. In a way, for you to actually define who you are, you need to have an other. You basically define yourself by saying, I am this because I'm not that. You have to kind of put a border to say that this is, this is where I am and this is where the other is. But the problem is when otherization happens within one society based upon fixed criteria. What I mean by fixed criteria is a criteria that you can't change. It's one thing to say that I'm an other from you because I hold different ideas, political positions, etc. But these things flow and ebb and flow as we go through life. Someone might be, for example, left-leaning, and when he grows up, he becomes right-leaning or reverse. These are open, what I call open categories. They're not closed. However, when the otherization is based upon race, when it's based upon culture, when it's based upon skin color, when it's based upon something that you can't change, that's when it becomes really dangerous and really toxic. The second step that actually flows out of this is collectivization. And it's very easy to go from we are one group and you're another group to go to you're all the same. They're all the same. Collectivization is especially problematic because when you collectivize someone, you take away his individuality. When you collectivize someone, you're actually dehumanizing them. It's also, we'll come to that when we talk about de-radicalization, but the more contact you have with people from the other group, the more you see that everyone is different. And so it's easy for you if you don't have that information, you don't have that intimate knowledge of the other, it's very easy to say, hey, they're all the same. And you just go with the stereotypes. Now, otherization and collectivization on their own, steps 1 and 2 on their own do not make you radicalized. Of course, one consequence of the radicalization roadmap is that radicalization is not a switch that you can switch on. It's not either on. It's not either or. It's not black or white. There are many shades of gray in between. So we cannot really speak. We should not speak about someone who is as radicalized or not radicalized. We can actually speak about them as how radicalized on the spectrum. Where do they stand? So I actually would think that steps number 1 and 2 might make you bigoted, but they don't really translate into something which is toxic and dangerous. Of course, it's not something that's nice, but I don't think it's something that's politically toxic yet. It hasn't come to that point. I think that the pivotal point when it comes to radicalization is the oppression narrative. The oppression narrative is that idea that not only are we others, I am a victim of your persecution. Which is to say that I am that your group is oppressing my group. What's really difficult about oppression narratives is that they're very deeply held. They form almost a cornerstone of your identity. Think about like going to a Jewish person and saying that you should not believe, you should not think so much about the Holocaust, for example. The Holocaust is right now a very important aspect of modern Jewish identity. Similarly, every group, every tribe out there has its own oppression narrative that that is very, it's very much used in their own, in telling their own story. And there's always an other who we otherize against, and we say they are the ones who are oppressing us. They are the ones who are persecuting us. Of course, I'm originally Palestinian, and again, the historical persecution of the Palestinian people, of course, that's the persecution narrative that I grew up with. Now the thing is, all persecution narratives, or let's say most of them, are actually based upon real persecution. They're not basically fantasies. There's not myths. There's actual real persecution behind it. The problem with persecution narratives is that they're uncritical. So we actually become obsessed with the other, and instead of using the persecution story to say that we have to be against all oppression, we have to be against all persecution, and we have to humanize our history, and we have to belong to all humanity, instead of doing that, it turns us in the other direction, because we're thinking more about we're victims, and since we're victims, anything we do is justified. Anything we do is okay because we're victims. And it creates this cycle of victimization. Now, step 4 is the collective guilt. And collective guilt is to say, not only are you persecuting us, every one of you is complicit. Every one of the other, every member of the other, every private individual is complicit in this grand persecution. And this transfers this from a very, the danger over here is that you're transferring this guilt from a group to an individual that you interact with or you hate. You make a person the direct object of your anger. Note over here point number 5. Point number 5, supremacism. I actually define radicalization when people ask me how do you define it, because I have people, the problem with the radicalization field, radicalization, counterterrorism, countering violent extremism, etc. I think there are 2 problems. First of all, the field is overly securitized. So we're talking a lot about security measures. We're not talking about what makes someone radicalized. Another problem, I think, which is annoying to academics, is that it's the language that we use, the terminology that we use, is very mushy. When we say extremism, fundamentalism, radicalization, these are actually they're not really that well chosen words. But we have this dilemma that we cannot redefine it. I mean, me as a researcher, I can't come and completely redefine all the terms because nobody's going to use my terminology. Nobody is going to understand it. So instead, we actually accept that the dominant terminology, and we simply redefine it. We redefine it to our own benefit, but we keep the words. So when people ask me what is radicalization, I say it's the process by which people come to adopt a supremacist, exclusivist worldview, where they view that rights and human dignity only belongs to their tribe, and other people are not as human as them. The opposite, I would say, the opposite of radicalization is not de-radicalization. The opposite of radicalization is coexistence. Coexistence as equals in mixed societies. That is actually the ideal that we want to talk about, and this is the liberal ideal. So why am I putting supremacism narratives as the center of the roadmap? It's because, and this might be a little bit difficult for, maybe I invite you to think about it a little bit. What makes someone someone flaunt their supremacism so much? When you see someone who's always talking about how great they are, what do they mean? What's there's something going on inside. What is that? It's actually that supremacism is a cover for an inferiority complex. When someone is all about how superior his tribe is actually that he has an identity crisis. there are certain reasons why in the world today we actually have a crisis of identity. And that crisis of identity is really what's fueling our crisis of fundamentalism and populism and radicalization. So supremacism narrative says we're better than them. And what flows from that is self-defense, which is to say that we have to defend ourselves. They're attacking us. We have to defend ourselves. So our violence, the violence that we exact, it's only retribution. It's only self-defense. We're actually not doing it. We're only defending ourselves. This is the natural response, and we simply want to stop their aggression. So this is the roadmap, and the roadmap itself. What I tell people is that it's reversible. It's not a one-way roadmap. So we can actually go up and we can go down, and we can actually reverse it. I think I want to take a break a little bit here and talk about why this is so important to discuss. And I think for the most part, we don't really need to talk about it a lot. I mean, a lot of people already know why it's important, but sometimes I think it's important to just to state the obvious. Radicalization is not only about violence. Violence is only like the tip of the iceberg that you see above the water. Radicalization is about the very idea of coexisting as equals in mixed societies. Why is that important? Well, because the planet is becoming more mixed. For certain reasons, as the human race was actually evolving, we ended up separate from each other. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that all human beings come from one ancestry. They all evolved in the same place, and we're actually all the descendants of African Homo sapiens who actually left Africa and searched for economic opportunities like 45,000 years ago. Or was it 200? I think there were like waves of immigration. But the fact is that eventually we kind of split up into our own languages, our own ethnicities, etc. Because we're separate from each other. We only talk to our own group. We only interact with our own group. We only intermarried with our own group. So some of us ended up being black. Some of us ended up being white, etc. But these things are not essential. Now with globalization, both economic globalization and information globalization, all of our societies are becoming more mixed. Whenever you have economic development, you have a lot of immigration. And whenever you have immigration, you have a lot of intermixing. So as we're becoming more mixed, the ideal of us living together as equals in one society, regardless of our origin, becomes more and more important. Radicalization actually thrives best in societies that have already been separated. They've already been sick. So a society that's already sick is kind of the perfect society for radicalization to take hold. I kind of, when it comes to tackling the problem, I think I kind of compare it to, I would say the worst way to look at radicalization is to look at it as static. To look at it as, okay, these people are radicalized, let's get rid of them and that's it. The fact is that it's more like a cancer where you're not only thinking about removing the tumor, but you're also thinking about healing the body. You don't want to actually kill the patient. Like one way to actually get rid of cancer is to kill the patient. But you don't want to do that. You don't want to inflict something like that on your society to actually make the problem even worse. So when I filed the first of my articles on radicalization to my colleagues at Civita, one of my colleagues, who's actually the peer reviewer, Marcus Stockheim, he commented saying, "What about collective radicalization?" So he's like, "Okay, this is fine. This is great. This actually explains radicalization on one-on-one basis. This would actually explain how you would go and recruit an individual. What about collective radicalization? What about the radicalization that we see among the populists, the Trump kind of radicalization?" And we actually had an article about that. And this is what we call the grand narrative, the populist grand narrative, 4 steps. The populist grand narrative is really about how you take radicalization and you kind of take it from person to person and you basically start pumping it to a society. Number one, we were once great, virtuous, and homogeneous. Number two, our sovereignty has been robbed by traitors and foreigners. There's always an external enemy and an internal enemy. Number three, we have to reclaim our sovereignty. And number four, this great, strong, punitive leader will make us great again. Whether it is make America great again, whether it's making Islam great again, whether it's making Britain great again, it's the same narrative. And I recognize this narrative because this is the narrative of the Islamists that I grew up with. Sometimes we wonder about, the state of the Middle East. It's because our populists won. This is what happened when our populists win. The populist narrative works on majorities. So you cannot actually create a sectarianized society. For example, when it comes to ISIS, how they tried to sectarianize and split Iraq, for example. They were, of course, very hostile towards Christians. However, I think they attacked Christians maybe 2 or 3 times. I'm not sure about statistics, but they hit Christian churches several times. But who did they hit the most? It was not Christians. It was Shias. Why? Well, because you cannot sectarianize and split society by attacking a minority. You have to attack a major section of the society. You want to split society, and you need to go 50-50 or 40-60 or something like that. You need to hit a really big element of society in order to sectarianize it, and that's why the main target was Shias, hitting basically. We talk about when I look at Oslo, and I love living in Oslo, but when I look at Oslo and I look at how tolerant the majority of Norwegians that I come to interact with are, it's great, of course, but I also wonder how tolerant would Norwegians be if there is a terror attack every week in downtown Oslo? What's going to be the result? What's going to be the effect on the kind of ideas which are in circulation among intellectuals in Oslo? And this is how you understand how Iraq was sectarianized and how these kind of narratives took hold. The populist grand narrative is actually half the story, because the populist narrative works on majorities. There is actually another narrative, which is the minority narrative. The minority narrative goes in reverse, and it says, we are the original inhabitants of this land. I don't have it up, unfortunately. Okay. Yeah. So the radicalization narrative of the majority says we're suppressed by elites and foreigners and minorities and must take our country back. This is the majority narrative. The minority narrative says we're suppressed by a savage majority and must rely on local tyrants for protection. And you can very easily see how the majority narrative and the minority narrative interlock. They interlock to create a cycle of increasing radicalization and increasing sectarianization and increasing split in society. Again, this is something that we kind of know in the inside, because this is the kind of stuff that happens. So you have the majority narrative working on Muslims, for example, in Egypt, and the minority narrative working on Christians in Egypt. You see the majority narrative working on Sunnis in Syria, and the minority narrative working on Alawites and Shias in Syria. And this is the interlock and basically give us an increasingly sick and increasingly sectarianized society. Anyway, I don't want to talk for too long, so I'm going to actually close by speaking a little bit. I'm going to go through this thread that I tweeted a long time ago. I think it was last year. It's a little bit about, it's a good thing about having a lot of content on Twitter is that I can use it for things like that. But these are basically 10 points about radicalization that I can just sum up the topic, and then basically we can give it to and have a discussion. I hope that when we have the discussion, we focus on solutions and we focus on de-radicalization, which I don't have the time to speak about right now, but I hope that we can discuss it a lot. So here's some very quick points. Radicalization is a universal human phenomenon and isn't restricted to only select cultures. The whole point about only Muslims become radicalized, that's not true. It's a human response, and it's a tribal response. It actually comes from our very innate, built-in tribalism. The antithesis of radicalization is coexistence as equals in mixed societies. The radicalized refuse to coexist with others as equals. So for the radicalized, either they want them out or they want them subjugated. They either want a segmented society where basically they're on top and other people are on the bottom, or they want them out, expel them, deport them, whatever. To actualize their worldview, the radicalized need to sow mistrust and fear and otherization and hatred among people. And hence, the narratives of hatred that they have to sow. They have to do this. The radicalized will follow the path of least resistance. This is an important point. They'll always follow a path of least resistance towards their goal, which means what? Which means that if they need to use violence, they will. And if they don't need to use violence, they don't have to. If they can create this kind of reality through an election, through electing, a jerk to office, then they'll do it. If they have to go beyond that and actually use violence, non-state violence, then they will. The reason why I emphasize this is because terrorism, we sometimes feel like we have to choose between terrorists and dictators and tyrants. And it is my belief, of course, that this is a false choice. They're actually frenemies, they're actually kind of allies to each other. And they both need enemies. I mean, in order for be it a terrorist or a tyrant to get you to acquiesce to their story, they need you to give them consent. And you give them consent when you say, I'm scared. The easiest way to get people to agree to the most senseless and the most immoral policies is not to teach them hate. It's actually to scare them. When we're scared, we become more accepting of authoritarianism. We become more accepting of group, group behavior, of groupthink, and we become more, we seek authoritarian figures for safety. So religious radicalization, and this is a topic I think it was a subtopic of us today that we're talking about religion and radicalization. Religious radicalization is not about religion. It's about the weaponization of a religion-based identity. It's about identity. It's not about faith. It's not about theology. It's all about identity. The role of ideology is really as a cement. So you basically, I tell this to people a lot of the time, and not many people believe it. But what really sends you towards radicalization is political stuff. It's politics that actually sends you there. And then the ideology holds you there. It's not the ideology that pulls you. The ideology actually holds you there once you're actually there. And I see that Usman is kind of giving me the look, so I think maybe we'll keep the rest. It's a lot to talk about, so I think we'll keep the rest to questions and answers. Usman?
Thank you. We will just settle down and then we will have a panel. And after that, we're going to have a break.